All right, and welcome back, everybody. We are still in the process of tracking what is now a very, very substantial hurricane. The Florida Panhandle has never in recorded history had a Category 4 storm make landfall, and that looks certainly possible later today because there's really no sign that it should weaken at all.
Right, and it's amazing that it came from like a tropical depression into a catastrophic event, and of course, you know, it hit those warm waters, and you only need about 80-degree temperatures to really help when these things intensify. And I think I saw the other day it was at 84. I know we don't have the water temperatures up right now.
Roughly in the mid-80s is what we're talking about, which is a couple of degrees above average for October, which has really helped to fuel this thing to become the hurricane that we're now seeing that's just off the coast. And yeah, just have never had a Category 4 make landfall in this part of the Gulf. So this is potentially be a really impactful storm. So with that being said, here we have the graphics full for you. Winds are now up to 140 miles per hour. And those are sustained winds. The gusts are even higher than that, likely up to 165 miles per hour with gusts possible surrounding the center of the storm.
And that's more of a Cat 5, correct?
Yeah, that would make it, that would classify it as a Category 5 wind gust, because Category 5 is anywhere from 155 miles per hour or greater. So the gusts are likely even stronger than that. And the center of the storm now is about 90 miles south-southwest of Panama City. So we're talking about landfall. Well, if it's moving at 13 miles per hour, we've got about 6 or 7 hours before this storm eventually makes landfall. So we'll be talking about landfall likely occurring at around lunchtime today near Panama City. It's starting to make that slight turn to the north-northeast. It was moving due north for about, oh goodness, about the past 24 to 36 hours. It was moving north, but now it's starting to make that turn north-northeast like that up towards Panama City. And still, Panama City looks to be ground zero for where we'll possibly...
The bullseye. Yes,
the bullseye of where we'll likely see landfall. So back in our neck of the woods across the Wiregrass, we've got some lighter outer bands of rain that have just now started to make their way up northward into southeast Alabama and Florida Panhandle and our counties in southwestern Georgia. We've got some moderate rain falling right now in parts of Enterprise and Geneva, Andalusia, Florala. These are just going to be continuing throughout the day. And I mean, if you thought it was any other day, you thought it'd just be a typical light rainy day. But later this afternoon, the wind speeds are really going to start kicking up for sure. And right now on Action Radar, you see a lot of the moderate rain showing up across most of South Alabama. That band of really heavy rain showing up there near Marianna in Florida, that band right there, this will probably progress north-northwest and likely make its way up into parts of Geneva County within the next 15 to 20 minutes or so. And zooming in a little bit closer, you know, moderate rain falling in parts of Florala, Geneva. Farther north, the rain coverage is not as impressive, and that's because the bands just haven't made their way that far inland yet. So near places like Troy and Clio and folks living along U.S. Highway 29, the rain hasn't quite made it there yet. And the wind speeds for now still relatively calm. We're talking about just 10 to 15 mile per hour winds. Really nothing that grabs your attention, but really later this afternoon it's really going to start to pick up. So here's what our forecast model is showing. 12:45 p.m. close to when the storm is making landfall near Panama City. We'll be talking about winds of the Wiregrass on the order of 25 to 35 miles per hour, which is just shy of tropical storm strength. But then those tropical storm force winds will really start to come in this afternoon. There you see 55 miles per hour coming in Bonifay, and 53 in Marianna, and 56 in Donaldsonville. Those will really be picking up. The gusts will likely be maybe a tad bit higher than this. Then 8:30 p.m. rolls around, and this is likely the big window is when the worst of the weather should be coming through. There you see 64 miles per hour showing up there in Donaldsonville. Yeah, these will be pretty powerful wind gusts for sure, and certainly enough to knock down trees and power lines, which we've been talking about. That's probably going to be the biggest problem that we run into with this. And by around midnight tonight, it starts to exit the region. Winds are still kicking at that time. The rain should be subsiding, but tomorrow morning, still looking at winds on the order of 20 to 30 miles per hour, still very breezy. We've got that flash flood watch in effect for all of our counties in southeast Alabama, a tornado watch for our counties in southwestern Georgia, and a couple of our counties in southern Florida. And that is because this is a landfalling tropical cyclone. We can't rule out the threat of spin-up tornadoes. Although with this event, Mandy, it doesn't really look all that likely because we're on the left-hand side of the storm.
Right.
And we've been looking at it over the past couple of hours. Really think that best tornado threat is going to be setting up along the I-10 corridor going from Tallahassee all the way over to Jacksonville. So it's a pretty large storm, and all the potential people that are going to be impacted by it.
Right, and that was the one thing we were talking about, of course. Still, our tornado threat is not zero, but very, very low in, like you said, the greatest chance, Tallahassee, and more along that I-10 corridor. But you still, want to treat this like a major severe weather event. And like we've been saying, if you're in a mobile home, of course, you want to go to maybe someone who has a sturdy house or home, or go to a shelter as well. And for people in apartments, also go into the lower part of the building thanks to those winds. And we also had someone on Facebook asking about, again, with the roads closed in Elba and Enterprise, and again, that's more towards the west of it, so more in the west part of the storm, but still you're going to have this tropical storm force winds, and of course that could still blow down some trees and stuff over the roadway, so you do want to be careful with that even in Enterprise and going to the west, but things won't be as bad. Our really hurricane force winds are going to be more in Geneva and Houston County for our Alabama counties.
And really, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter exactly how strong the wind is, because 45 miles per hour, 75 miles per hour, it doesn't matter. The power lines and the trees are still going to come down, and we're still going to have more than likely the same problems that we would have whether this was Category 4 or even a Category 1. I mean, Hurricane Hermine 2 years ago did plenty of damage in northern Florida. That was only a Category 1 when it made landfall. And I'm not saying that this will be on the same order as what Hurricane Hermine did. This will likely be a little bit stronger, if anything. But nonetheless, it's going to be a very impactful storm for most people across the Wiregrass.
Yeah, we've been saying this is one for the generations. So of course, you want to go ahead and take precautions. And like we've been stressing, the best time to do that is this morning, because we're having a lot of people ask, about driving, going to work later, and that kind of thing. We had, one woman asked us about, she lives in Georgia, but has to drive to Dothan. But just remember, later this afternoon, or earlier in the afternoon, we're going to start to feel those tropical storm force winds, probably around 1 p.m. to 1 to 5. And then after that, later into the afternoon and into the early evening hours, that's when we're going to start to feel the more hurricane force winds, which is about roughly around 74 miles per hour or greater, and probably have some gusts greater than that as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it's going to be one of those storms that we're just going to have to, once we get to lunchtime, we're going to have to hunker down, wait for the storm to pass, and just avoid driving as much as possible if you can. And I'm hopeful that a lot of businesses will just kind of shut down and just kind of heed the warnings and
which a lot have, and we do have that full list on our website as well, dothanfirst.com, full list of closings as far as businesses and schools and churches and everything else. And we also have a list of shelters for people who do live in those mobile homes.
Yes.
If you need to go to a shelter as well.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for a moment, if that's all right, and we'll do a quick reset, and then we'll go over some of the more impacts that we can expect from Hurricane Michael as it gets closer to making landfall. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back, everybody. Glad you could join us as we are tracking Hurricane Michael as it becomes closer to making landfall, likely near Panama City later this afternoon. We have Oscar joining us on the set, who I understand has not really, this really isn't your first rodeo, so to speak. You've been through plenty of storms in the past.
Yeah, I have been referred to as a rodeo clown, but yeah, it's not my first rodeo, that's for sure.
Right. And I know you probably experienced some of Hurricane Opal when it came through in 1995.
I was in Columbus, Georgia at the time, and
Okay.
here's a funny story. Okay, I'm at the station in Columbus, Georgia, which will not be named.
All
Okay,
right.
they had a generator, but they had it inside the building. So they were testing it before Opal came because, okay, we're going to be ready.
Yeah.
So the generator's in the building and they crank it up, and of course those noxious diesel fumes they're not vented outside,
no.
so they're inside. So okay, we'll deal with that. Okay, so here comes Opal. So sure enough, there goes the power. So they go to and crank up the diesel, and it's running for about 5 minutes, and all of a sudden it goes clack, 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 and
Oh no.
they had neglected to go get diesel fuel. So they didn't have any diesel.
Oh,
So,
Yeah,
we just all sat around the rest of the night, kind of, hey, how about that wind out there?
Well, we're kind of out of luck.
Somebody want to make a beer run or whatever?
Goodness.
But yeah, that was one of
What
those.
a nightmare.
Yeah, it kind of was. I mean, because
Yeah.
we would thought that they were prepared to do the coverage, but
So it didn't
not work
take
out.
long for the power to go out.
yeah, actually, we were out power for 4 days where I was. A lot of trees went
Wow.
down. But the fortunate thing was it was early October, and we didn't have the luck of a cold front coming on the heels of it like this one's going to have.
Right.
But
It
it
was
was
pretty hot
fairly,
afterwards,
well, it
probably.
was warm, but it was the dew points were fairly low after the storm exited. Unlike, say, if it happened in August. That would
Right.
have been a different story
Yeah,
or whatever.
and that's another common problem that people run into with all the power outages. If this was a storm in August and the power goes out,
Sweltering.
yeah, you
yeah.
have to deal. The aftermath is almost worse than the storm itself.
And it's the same
And,
thing if you got a really if you're somewhere and you got enjoying the cold weather and it's the snow is coming down, and everybody say, "Isn't this great? Isn't this just a great winter scene?" And all of a sudden,
Until the power goes out.
The power goes
And
out,
you're freezing.
and you see how
And you're
fast it
stuck.
gets cold. And
Yeah.
it is so much harder to get your body warm from cold than it is to try to cool off in hot. I'll take
Right.
no power in hot weather versus no power in cold weather.
Yeah, pretty easy to stay cool. I think AC units use a lot less energy than heaters, so it's funny that you bring that
It
up.
does, yeah, it does seem to have a higher bill. The thing I want to mention too about the hurricanes is, it's really easy to fall into this trap about you see the nice presentation of a satellite or especially the radar, and then we talk about the maximum winds with the storm. But the thing is, those 130, 140 mile an hour winds only within about 10 miles of the eyeball.
That's true.
Right of the
That's
center.
worth pointing out.
And
Absolutely.
then if you go out about 20 miles, then you start to noticeably drop down to, if it's a 140 hurricane, then they're down to about 110. And even in the advisories that come out from the Hurricane Center, they say hurricane force winds extend out, in this case, the last one said 45 miles.
Yes.
So once you're 45 miles away from the eye, you're not having hurricane force winds. So you are in that, it's 185 mile tropical storm force winds extend out.
Yeah.
But you've got to be pretty close to that eye to get the really slamming of those winds. And a lot of people, unfortunately, in the past, hopefully that doesn't happen now, but if they live like 50 or 60 miles away and here came this really intense hurricane and there was all this devastation near the center, and when we didn't have the communications like we have now, they'd say, well, that was supposed to be a bad hurricane. I didn't notice any really bad effect
Yeah.
because they weren't at ground zero like Panama
Right.
City is.
Like with Hurricane Andrew is another good example of that, where those Category 5 winds only devastated maybe a very small portion of Miami.
And the weird thing about Andrew is it came through as a 4, but it was 10 years later, actually it was about 15 years later, they said, upon further review, we have
Yeah.
decided Andrew
They
was
go
a 5.
back and say
And then
it's a
people are
5.
probably going, well, gee, thanks a lot, But,
Doesn't do us any good now.
yeah,
yeah. But yeah, it...
that appears to be a shortcoming of the Saffir-Simpson scale in general. I mean, we had plenty of complaints come in with the Saffir-Simpson scale when Florence was coming through because it made it to Category 4, really quickly weakened to a
Right.
Category 1 before landfall, but it didn't really matter what the category was because the impacts were still the same. Some places had as much as 3 feet of rain.
Yeah,
And
well, we had a Tropical Storm Tropical Storm Alberto back in 4th of July in
Yes.
1994. And I was in Columbus at the time, and that thing came up, hit around just east of Panama City and near Apalachicola, and hit midday and afternoon, the winds had died down, the sun came out, and it was picture perfect along the coast. And then the thing comes up basically along the Alabama-Georgia line, gets near Atlanta, stalls, and sinks back down, then kind of slides back in Alabama. After 3 or 4 days, you know, we have anywhere from 15 to 25 inches of rain, and there's 30 people that drown.
Yeah, and that's especially problematic.
But the winds were not a factor.
Yeah,
but
every storm is, I know it's kind of a cliche, but every storm is unique in the impacts that they bring. And luckily with this, I don't really think that that's going to be a problem with this because it's moving relatively quickly, 12, 13 miles
and looking
per
at the
hour.
last infrared, it looked like when it was in the north central Gulf about 6 hours ago, it looked like it had reached its ideal state. It had that deep,
and that perfect atmosphere,
perfect symmetry, and it had that really deep, intense purple. But as it's approached land, it's starting to lose some of that definition, and we're starting to see some of that intense infrared satellite shot depiction. As it's reaching land, it's retracting back over the water. So it looks like the storm is almost, the intensity is still there, but it's shrinking even smaller. And as long as it keeps moving that 12, 14 miles an hour, then boom, boom, it's in and out really quick. But yeah, again, if you're at Panama City, Hurricane Center has it plotted coming in just east of Panama City Beach, like you said, early afternoon. And of course, Mexico Beach, which is about 10 miles southeast of Panama City, is going to get the brunt of it. Tallahassee's really going to get whacked because they're on that white quadrant.
On the right front quadrant.
And then up through, say, Valdosta.
And if we could very briefly, let's pull up the graphics really quickly, full screen, and we can show what Oscar's talking about. We have this little area here in the right-hand side where the cloud tops are just a little bit more ragged.
They look disrupted.
Yes, and that could be because the storm is interacting with land a little bit out ahead of it, and that's kind of disrupting the structure. But on the left-hand side of the storm, we really have these really brighter shades of orange that are showing up here. That's the really intense convection, the really cold cloud tops that you have with really intense thunderstorms. But usually, I mean, like you said, in order for this to be a perfect storm, it have to be more symmetrical.
And I really think that goes back to the historical fact that, okay, it's key to remember that when Tallahassee came out with an interesting little map early this morning showing a diagram of the area from Destin over to Cedar Key, saying this is the amount of hurricanes that have been Cat 4 that have hit this area. And they said, yes, you see blank screen because we haven't had any yet. But the key here is in recorded history.
And it only goes back to 1851.
And if you go back 200-300 years, if you had survivors, we lived that long, people could probably regale you with stories about, they're really bad. Camille, when it hit in 1969, it so happened that in history, 150 years almost to the month, earlier in that same area, they had another, what would have been a Cat 5 hurricane in that area. There was an island off Louisiana called Last Island that was a resort area in 1856. And of course, people didn't know about this stuff, but they had breezes, so they would get away from the humidity and go down to this island. And that island just got whacked off the map with a Cat 4, and about 400 people drowned because they didn't know what was coming and what was going on. And in fact, at the time that hurricane hit in 1856 off Louisiana, there were a lot of people meeting in New Orleans that very weekend talking about, hey, this resort we've got in Last Island is really going great guns. Let's double the size of it next year. And unknown to them, a hurricane was wiping it out. And of course, nothing's now except a national preserve for animals, birds.
And I mean, like you said, our database does not go back very far in terms of.
Well, there was no, like the Native Americans were kind of smart. They didn't have any settlements on the coast. I think somewhere along the way they figured out this is not really smart to do it. I always used to ask a remark in class. A question was, everybody that's familiar with history knows St. Augustine is the longest established settlement in this country. I think it's 1564. I said, but do you realize 3 years before a settlement was started, that had it maintained continuity, it would be the answer to that question, not St. Augustine. I said, can you name where that was? And they kind of guessed around or whatever. And I said, the reason I bring it up is it was Pensacola, and it got wiped out by a hurricane. But the English and the Spanish kept trading control rights to that area for about 150 years. And each one would come in and heard what happened to the previous one, and they'd say, well, they didn't know how to do it. We'd plan a community. And then boom, within 10, 15, 20 years, here came another probably Cat 4 type hurricane and would wipe it out. But the Native Americans never had any settlements along the coast, and I just found that kind of interesting. Maybe they may have had it long ago, but they learned like, no, don't do that.
This is probably not the best idea. I mean, places like New Orleans that are below sea level.
Well, in New Orleans, when it was established in around 1800 or so, actually was right at sea level. I think it was an inch or two below. But southern Louisiana is sinking. You know, it's just part of the continental drift, the tectonics.
It's built right on the Mississippi River
and that's
Delta.
why Louisiana doesn't have any good beaches, because it's basically marsh wetlands, and it's all, and that last island is pretty much a result of that. But again, southern Louisiana is just wetlands and sinking, and of course they screwed the Mississippi up, the Army Corps of Engineers, by making it a straight shot, and Katrina was a natural disaster for Mississippi, but really it was a man-made disaster for New Orleans, because it just pushed the Gulf back up that channel, and then basically all that water was coming up, and it found a weak spot in the dike and knocked the wall over, and there it went.
Much appreciated with your insight, Austin.
I didn't mean to get going
I
here.
like getting the history lessons.
Yeah, we got a good history lesson.
Very good. Yeah, we need that perspective, definitely, as meteorologists, for sure. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Oscar.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to take a quick short break.
I think we have a cam outside of Panama City.
We do have a camera to show you really quickly in Panama City. Okay, sun's starting to come up now, so we're getting better visibility of the surf, which is really getting a little bit, definitely more choppy out there for sure, as more outer bands of Oscar begin to come to shore. I think now the center of the storm, about 90 miles offshore from Panama City. There's a live look at it.
And this is a live shot from Pineapple Willie's there in Panama City. Surf's getting rough out there.
Pineapple Willie's, familiar landmark for many of us. All right, we'll be right back after this break.